I am super excited today. Today's episode, we're going to delve into the mystique of creativity, the arcane, with our distinguished guest from MJDorian.com. MJ, glad to have you on the show. One of the things I want to share with you, and I want to share with our listeners, I think is important, is you're an accomplished composer, visual artist, and a deep thinker. And if you go to his podcast, and I encourage all of you to do that now, it's Creative Codex, creative and then Codex. You're going to see what I'm talking about. I was literally blown away by the Carl Jung and Alchemy series that he has on there, and he has a bunch of others, and we're going to get into those. But we're going to go in today in landscape of music. We're going to get into some art. We're going to talk about ancient wisdom of alchemy, and we're just going to uncover the secrets that lie at the transcendental. So let's look at this in a way that has an open mind. And MJ, so glad that you're able to be on Higher Density Living.
Jason, oh man, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on, and looking forward very much to talking about these topics, which are very much recently my two favorite topics of Jung and alchemy. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I want to start off with what has led you to become an award-winning composer? Because I know the music and the podcast you compose, correct?
Yeah. I that's one of the things that engages me most about the creative aspect of this podcast I do, Creative Codex, is writing narrative music to a lot of these stories of these creative geniuses that we tell on the show. And that comes from my background in terms of my formal training is as a composer. I went to college in the Conservatory of Music here in Brooklyn College for music composition, and then I went to NYU specifically for film scoring. I worked in the film industry for about a decade, had various successes there, and the show is kind of this mesh of all these various influences and creative hats that I love to wear.
Yeah, and you're doing different voices, you're doing different music. That's what makes it so engaging and inviting. But you just said something I think that's super interesting, and that is how important music is and how important it is to our life. You've seen those funny videos on YouTube where they take like a scene out of the movie, and I know you guys had done this in school, and then you put something else in there, and it changes the whole scene. Like even the way that the actors are talking and stuff like that, it kind of just ruins it. So
it's powerful. It's a powerful thing. Yeah, we don't consider it. One little side note on that to add to that would be that in studies, it's been confirmed that when we're listening to a piece of music, our heart rate will start to adjust to the beat of that music. So if it's a fast song, our heart rate will, just from listening listening this, even on headphones, our heart rate will start to get a little faster. If it's a slow, classical piece of music, our heart rate will start to go slower. It's immediate physiology reaction.
Yeah, it's so wild. Last night I was just on a plane and I was listening to classical music just to kind of relax and work, and then listening to your podcast. But this is a crazy part about music is we take it to the gym and we listen to it. It's so right what you're saying right now. What were some of the things that you learned in, especially not just in music production, pop music production, but in film too?
I mean, it's so much. We could talk about it for the entire length of the show, but I mean, I'll just say that in working so closely with films, what you end up developing as a composer is you're working on one scene. Sometimes you have to sit with that scene and rewatch it literally dozens of times. Each movie that you work on, or that I would work on, I would rewatch dozens of times, because what you're doing is you're learning and internalizing the pacing of the narrative, of the characters, of that emotional world. And so what ends up happening is you end up really having an intimate understanding of this realm of music and emotion, and how the two intertwine and how that influences narrative. So that's really probably the most valuable thing to me is kind of, it taught me how to recognize nuances of emotion and kind of motivations of characters, which translates to motivations of people in real life. You sit down, you watch somebody walking around the room, and you can start to consider what is their motivation right now. Mm-hmm. What are they thinking? Are they planning something? Are they walking over to this person? And so you kind of start to analyze what's happening internally with people around you too.
Yeah, and you did. Speaking of music, and this is so interesting because we're talking about Carl Jung and kind of more of a spiritual, esoteric side of things. But you also did Kurt Cobain,
Yeah.
and what I mean, and we're in music now. We're talking about this. So, what inspired that? Is it just a love of his music, or?
I mean, a lot of these figures that I cover on the show are personal idols of mine in some fashion or at some point in time. Kurt Cobain was a very personal one to me because when I started guitar when I was just about a teenager, I was listening to Nirvana all the time, and I was really getting really occasionally moved by some of the things that he expressed in his music. And so obviously then that morphed into a fascination with his life and all of that. So he was one of my first creative idols in a sense.
Yeah, and those are amazing too. If people like music, I encourage them to go to that. When you decided to start, and that's been 5 years you've worked with the Creative Codex podcast, what do you vision as the mission of the podcast? Like, what are your hopes with it, as far as you putting that special gift and abilities that you have out into the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important thing to keep in mind and have an understanding of whenever you're working on any big project like that, right? The one now it's kind of morphed into multiple missions, but I mean the one mission that's always been threading through all the episodes is this idea of what is creative genius. Why do some people, sometimes as rare as once in a generation, come along that completely turn an industry on its head, or that are able to create works of art, music, any medium that move people, that change society, that leave lasting effects on culture? And what is that? Why are we not teaching this and studying it in school? It seems like it's integral to culture and the benefits. It has a beneficial effect on the world. So I saw a deficiency there in media that I was consuming, and I honestly just started to write and create a show that I wanted to be listening to, and that's been the underlying motivation, aside from some other ones as well.
That's amazing. It's something, from a spiritual aspect, we're on a spiritual podcast, like we talk about this a lot. It's like, how does someone like a Carl Jung or even, like Tesla or any of these people, how are they able to tap into that, and Stephen Pressfield calls it the Muse, which I like, it's kind of this external thing that you can tap into, and trying to allow it. We've had, whether you believe it or not, we've had people talk about like you can channel that, it's aliens, like the list goes on and on. But what do you think is allowing people to be so creative to the point that they change society? I mean, Carl Jung, the more you study him, the more he's like, who is this guy? Where did he come from?
Yeah. So, we could probably write a list that kind of sums up a general formula that you see in these kinds of figures. And that's very interesting to do because it only becomes obvious when you've done something like, let's say, with what I've been doing with my show, with the research. After 5 years of only studying these kinds of figures, you start to see certain patterns emerge. And it's not necessarily that they're all like somehow neurodivergent and on the spectrum or anything, although some of them are, which helps them think outside the box. But you can definitely say some patterns emerge, such as most all of these kinds of figures are outliers in some fashion. They're either outliers specifically, like literally in their society, they're kind of just weirdos. Kind of Nikola Tesla was one of these kind of oddballs. He was a germaphobe during the early 1900s. He always dressed in a tux. He was just this tall, lanky dude who could do cartwheels and was a vegan when nobody else was caring about that stuff. And so whenever you would shake his hand because he was a germaphobe, he had to run and wash his hands. So there's literal outliers, but also just people who are outliers intellectually, and they're comfortable in that role. And this is just something that comes from also having in terms of like the big five traits in psychology, as they're called, the big factors, having an openness to experience, a very high openness to experience, correlates with a lot of these kinds of figures. So, they could spend multiple days in a museum or reading books and kind of really feeding their intellect and growing that kind of that rich soil in their inner world that then leads to substantial and consequential works. So I'm working on that. I'm like narrowing down something like a list of like, these are the habits, traits, tendencies of these kinds of people. But thank you for bringing that out.
That sounds like a book, MJ.
I think could be.
I think you need to write that. Because when you're looking at these creative geniuses, and I kind of want to, let's just pause here for just a little bit before we get into anything else. When you're looking at them, like for instance, I'd forgotten all about the movie Amadeus, which is an amazing movie, old school
love
movie, and so you look at like Mozart, for instance, and you look at, it's like people know who he is even now. You can type, people know who Jesus is, it's a guy that just kind of walked around, was only there, he wasn't even, he only lived for like 30 something years. Alexander the Great's the same, and they still say he's the greatest strategist for military, and they're still amazed at how he was able to do what he was able to do. When you look at these creative geniuses, how do you choose which one? Because it would be a long list, I think, that would change society. You have art, which, for me and you're attracted to that, I'm attracted to that. I think that changes culture probably more than anything. But when you're looking at these creative geniuses, how do you choose which to feature on your podcast?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Because one, I while creating this kind of list and preferential items of people on that list, I don't want to just narrow it down to like visual art, only painters, or who we have covered, like Leonardo da Vinci, but he was also an inventor, or Frida Kahlo, or Vincent van Gogh. But I also, my part of this mission is to show that creative genius exists in basically every medium you can imagine, and even in mediums that aren't traditionally thought of as artistic or creative, like electrical engineering with Nikola Tesla, or psychology with Dr. Carl Jung. I see him as being a creative genius in this line of these kinds of figures. And he just happened coincidentally to be in psychology, And so as far as that's concerned, when I look at these kinds of figures, two things have to stick out to me. One, they have to have created consequential work. So some body of work that people, hundreds of years later keep returning to. What's going on with these kinds of classical pieces of music that I'll sometimes teach my piano students, and I'll say, this song has existed for hundreds of years. Imagine you could write something that people will play hundreds of years after you pass away. Like something so substantial, so interesting, so either catchy or consequential in some way. And so that's one factor. And then the other factor would be the narrative. Looking at their life, seeing what kind of lessons can be gleaned from taking a journey through their life and through the lessons and trials and tribulations that they went through, basically.
Do you look at are like when you look at this, because this is so interesting to me, is your podcast mainly going to be on creative geniuses, or like you did one episode where you did a Grimm's folklore, with the bottle and the demon and stuff like that, and one of your Carl Jung, and that was like so beautifully done. I re-listened to it a second time.
Thank you.
Are you looking at like other pieces of work too? Have you ever thought about that, or like like doing something like a Grimm's or something like that?
Yeah, in the sense of this larger context of how would that kind of work influence society, and what kind of value does it perhaps have for other creative people in that society? So I recently started getting requests from people to do an episode about the tarot. And even though I'm personally incredibly engaged and interested in studying the tarot, and I don't even know how many tarot decks at this point.
Same.
Perhaps you're the same, yeah?
Yeah, it's exact. I got some sitting right here.
Yeah. They're always there on any good trip or any rainy day. It's good to have them on hand. So I got these requests, and at first my initial reaction is, well, the tarot, we don't know who created it. But then I start to think, oh, we don't know who created it. It's just kind of this tradition of humanity and these pockets of culture that keep working on it, evolving it, and largely even keeping some of the symbols, respectfully the same. And so that there's something there, because if one person, you could say, was this creative genius that created the tarot, I would want to make, some kind of a study of that person in an episode.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this body of work called the tarot that is worked on by civilization. And so that's another angle I think that I'm going to start considering as well. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, that's cool. Those would be great episodes on the tarot. Yeah, because there's so many. I mean, there's a lot of people that take credit for it, and you've got such a esoteric thread going through all of that. Like especially with D.A. Waite, and like just really, it's so interesting. And then like some people are saying there's an allure to it to back in Egypt. So yeah, that would be kind of just to compile something that's all together.
Right.
That would be interesting. And that's kind of what I want to ask you. Can you share some insights in what approach you do from like a deep dive approach, and how you explore their minds, and what works you look at with these creative geniuses? Like, what's your approach to that once you decide who you want to choose?
Yeah. So it's very much an all-consuming work, because one, I want to get these episodes out in a timely fashion. So that creates a good motivation. You have a sense of an impending deadline, lights a fire under you to get started. And also just a lot of reading. I get a lot of resources. I like physical books. So no matter which figure I'm covering, like right now I'm covering the fashion designer Alexander McQueen. So I have a biography of him that is thought of as a good, accurate one. And then I have a bunch of books that are more specific about his fashion shows and great imagery and from his works and stuff. So it really, there's a lot of my head in books, a lot of that time spent that way and scribbling in there and trying to find both narrative threads that I think are compelling, but also then kind of these deep dives into their significant works. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's very much an all-consuming process. It's like saying I'm going to spend an unbelievable amount of time with my head in this person's life and work,
Well, you can even tell, like, on the page you did for Alchemy, and it's MJDorian.com /alchemy. And I'll put it in the show notes. But you could tell, I mean, like, you took the time. That's a lot of work just on that page. And then the other pages where you have all the artwork. And then you made sure that you found ones that had, high scan rates, so that they look beautiful. So people can use them as, like I did, a screensaver or whatever on your computer. So, that shows right there. I mean, you could go to your show notes and the pages that you built, the landing pages you built, that there's a deep dive approach, like you're not just, kind of reading one or two books and then kind of throwing some music together and being a storyteller. You know what I mean? It seems like there's more thought put into it than just being, do you see what I'm saying? Like, not just a storyteller.
Sure. Totally. I get you. I once heard an aphorism of a sort said that I kind of internalized very much so, and I continue to follow, which is that choose to do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. So, I could look up Wikipedia and just rehash the stuff that's there for any of these kind of creative figures. And sure, that stuff, is full of useful knowledge too, or references to follow through on. But in the process of doing the kind of work yourself, you realize, like, whoa, there's all these little pockets of richness, and you can strike gold here and there that nobody else has really focused on. And I can't tell you how many times I've revisited something like Carl Jung's Red Book and been like, no one's ever talked about this passage. This passage is full of everything. This passage has everything he could possibly say about, like, kind of a premonition about his work that he's going to have with alchemy, and I've never heard anyone talk about it. Like, you wouldn't discover that if you weren't pursuing that kind of thread yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Whenever you begin to look at Carl Jung, and I kind of wanted to get into him a little bit, because you've done so
Yeah.
much work. It's so weird to me, and tell me if this is your through all your studies, what was happening in the early 1900s? It's like something unusual. Like I'm like esoteric type, so something was happening. I mean, if you've heard of the blonde lady with Hitler, that was like supposedly channeling aliens, and you look her up and she was like this super long blonde hair. Henry Ford was Tesla, everybody was mesmerized by her, and then and she was like some figure that was just bouncing around the world, and then you have somebody like Carl Jung, and then he's with Freud, and then you're like, well, hey, he's significant. There's just like so many significant things that were happening. Rudolf Steiner, which you've ever read his stuff is like will blow your mind. It's like, how did he know architecture, agriculture, like all this regenerative farming is happening right now? It's all coming from Rudolf Steiner's work. It's like it seemed like a lot of stuff happened in the early 1900s, if that makes sense.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's one of my favorite time periods for that reason. It's kind of this moment where is a confluence of so many factors in the world and in society, and industrialization is kind of like really picked up, and people need a new source of energy, which Nikola Tesla comes along and solves that. And culture is moving forward in both in sciences, but also you're right with pointing out that there's a very engaging element with the occult movement during that time period, occult thought, metaphysical thought, and it's all just in that soup. I can only imagine, there's really no one explanation for it. It's just this every once in a while in history, there's just this incredible confluence of all these different factors that create like a magic moment that everybody is engaged in some way in these very fascinating practices or studies. Something similar to like, the Renaissance. I mean, we see these periods of time and culture happening kind of in these waves throughout every century, every 2 centuries. And that's the only way I can personally explain it. But yeah, I love that time period, the early 1900s,
yeah, I know.
late 1800s.
Yes, it's just so beautiful, and the work that was created, the architectural buildings, everything. I mean, you're in New York there. When you look at Carl Jung, and I know you chose to pick him, which is awesome. I mean, creative genius, up there, top list. What was the first thing that was fascinated? Like, you're like, I have to do this with this guy. This guy's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, because you said I chose to pick, I would say he kind of picked me in a very strange way. I think he's still, he's out there with his little tentacles of influence. I mean, it's very reassuring to see how people are becoming more and more interested in what he was talking about and his theories, and there's this kind of sense of a crisis of meaning in some pockets of society, and people are turning to Jung to answer that, and it's refreshing. So
do you feel it's how open he was, especially with his time periods of, whether it was, and a lot of these creative geniuses have had huge bouts with depression and, rejection and issues, because they are on the fringe. Do you feel like it's him, the openness that he had with that, that allow people to be able to make a connection, and then he's trying to figure it out himself? Like, he's going heavy. Like, I mean, just his shadow work stuff alone is worth, studying him. Is that do you like that he's open like that? I mean, like, what was the main thing that drawn you to him? Or like you said, he chose you, but.
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, I would say one of the factors that draws me to him, as well as I think many other people, is this idea that you mentioned, that you could see he's wrestling with it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He doesn't start with all the answers. I mean, he starts as this kind of heir apparent to Freud, and Freud has these very specific concepts about what the unconscious is, and that man and woman are full of these neuroses that are always somehow linked to some kind of sexual element from their childhood. And then Jung says, well, wait a second. There's plenty of things that humans do and think about that isn't always regarding sex. And so he's wrestling with this himself. He's like, well, this guy who's my mentor, he must be wrong about all this stuff, because there's so many other elements. And why does Freud seem to kind of push aside man's search for meaning and spirituality and religion? He kind of just thinks it's just fantasy play. So already from the beginning of his career, he's wrestling with very serious questions. And that kind of approach to the mind and human life, it continues all the way through to his deathbed. Honestly, he never really says like, this is the answer. He continues to be fascinated by all this stuff just as much as we are, and he attempts in his pursuit, in his wrestling with these topics, to answer these facets of human experience that basically no other psychologist dares to touch. And I think that's what's compelling about him to this day.
What was, when you look at alchemy and Carl Jung, what drove you to pick that, not just the life and work of Carl Jung, but specifically Carl Jung and alchemy? Like, you made that, and then you have your series on that. What was that connection?
Yeah, so it was incremental because I had already done two episodes about Carl Jung's Red Book, which were episodes 11 and 12, or 12 and 13. Then I did about 3 episodes about a specific passage in Carl Jung's Red Book called The 7 Sermons to the Dead. And then I keep revisiting him. It's such a rich material. And then I was like, well, it feels like this work isn't over yet. And I was like, well, what was he doing toward the end of his life? What was his focus? And his last great written work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, is this 500-page book all about alchemy and very esoteric. It's one of these books that, again, people who go and study psychology and then become Jungian analysts themselves, they even have trouble with this thing. They're like, well, that's just him being Jung, and we have no frame of reference for that. And so I thought, well, what's this? What's this all about? And I personally am also very engaged by esoteric traditions and studying Western esoteric practices and traditions. So I saw obviously this thread of alchemy in there, and I just went wild with it. I still love it. It's, even after finishing those episodes, I'm still thinking about it and reading about it.
Yeah, and I know I've listened to a couple podcasts you've been on, and you talked about some of the principles of alchemy that you've practiced in certain things. What do you feel, before we get back into Jung, what do you feel alchemy in and of itself, how is it relevant to modern world? Because we see in your podcast, you talk about it going in and out of style, even to the point of like Christianity coming in, and then there's persecution if you're an alchemist. What do you feel like now in this modern world, that how alchemy can help?
Yeah, fantastic question. How is it relevant to me? To start, I would say that, in the words of this author, Jeffrey Raff, who's also a Jungian analyst, and he wrote a book about the alchemical imagination and Jung's view of it. Alchemy is the tradition that refuses to die. So no matter how many wars, changes in public opinion, no matter what's going on in society, it's existed for 2,000 years. It continues to exist today, and people continue to practice it, despite the fact that people who are more empirical will say, what is this garbage, this pseudo chemistry and such. But it continues to be a compelling and fascinating view of that's based on one core question, I would say, and that being, what is your relationship to matter? It's what you're confronted with as you place one of your first items in the alembic or in your pot. In this case, I'm thinking of a crushed piece of plant called a lemon balm that you're instructed in one of the lessons that I was practicing. So when you place this crushed piece of dried plant into this pot and you start to heat it, you start to also consider, what is my relationship to this thing? Well, what am I doing here? As you start to engage it more and go through these various processes, you realize your relationship to matter is changing. And now you're not just this kind of silent observer of what happens in the world and matter. You're not just kind of a victim of it. You're not, at odds with it. You're becoming a part of nature, and you're becoming a force of change in matter, because that's the core of alchemy is transmutation. It's just change. It's also purification of the matter that you're working with and purification of yourself. But in that process, you start to notice there's a shift. You're no longer just this, anonymous little point of consciousness on this planet, this blue planet in the vast universe. You're actually now a part of nature, and you're a little force of change that has a bit of influence in it.
You mentioned transmutation, and I love that word, and it just sounds cool. But for me, looking at Jung's work and listening to your podcast, understanding, and a lot of people may not choose to actually get a pot or a burner or whatever and do things, but I think people miss the aspects of spiritual alchemy and what that looks like, in your own personal life. Like you mentioned Alexander McQueen, you're doing something with him. I mean, to me, all fashion designers are alchemists. I mean, in a form or a way, to be able to take that raw matter or that raw materials and to create some art,
right.
And you're creating art out of fabric, so, and
True.
that's transmutation to me. Can you talk a little bit more about that concept of transmutation and its significance in the world, whether it's in art or music or whatever it may be?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is the process of taking something from point A to point B to point C. How do you get from point A to point C? What happens in the middle? All of life is some form of transformation, whether you want it to or not. Whether you want it to or not, something is going to bump up against the little path that you're traveling in life and compel some kind of transformation out of you. And so I think that that's the core truth of these kinds of traditions, especially of alchemy. It's at its heart. It's based on something that is inescapable in life, which is some form of process and transformation. And as you work with these rather ambiguous reactions, in the pot, you see things bubbling, you see things smoking, you see things turning into black forms, and then you see that black form turning into white ash. As you work with these various processes, it inevitably causes reactions in you that relate to your personal life in bizarre and interesting ways. And so that physical aspect of working with the matter, I think, is a key aspect that people don't realize until they try the work, because it metaphorically causes changes in you, because everything is a process of transformation in a sense.
Do you think the intent of the person, like whether it's Alexander McQueen or whether it's, Mozart, whoever it may be, the intent of the person when they're in this phase of creating something that's, and maybe they realize it, maybe they don't, and maybe they know that their legacy, who knows? I know a lot of have had, like you said, been on the spectrum or been super egomaniacs, what we would label as that. Do you feel like in that process of creativity, when they're creating a masterpiece, like if you could like watch that transmutation happen, what do you think is going on there? Like in that process, they're watching the black go to the ash and but what creates something that is legacy and lasting like that? That's the mystery to me of the creativity, is like, how do you make, how many downloads does Kurt Cobain get? every day, on
Mm-hmm.
Spotify. I mean, it's probably, I know he has hundreds of millions on YouTube and, probably a billion, views. What makes people's work last? Because we can get into the technical side of things, like how good of a guitarist was he? I mean, that list of all those technical questions. But this esoteric spiritual transmutation, what do you think that process is in the creative side?
Wow. I like this. I like these questions, Mr. Rigby. So the way I see it, I mean, it's a confluence of factors. Any great work of art, creativity, whatever you put on the table, even, a masterpiece of culinary art, it's a confluence of factors, and we can break those down in various ways. But one of the key elements there that you can say all of these great creatives have is a sense for following intuition, is a sense that
I like that.
there,
Yes.
that there are influences outside of their reach, outside of their understanding, outside of their control, and they could mean anything. I mean, you could say, if you want to be reductionist, it's just the unconscious mind, and behind the curtain there's just things always boiling up. There's it's a melting pot of influences, and it has its own. Jung sometimes theorized that there are aspects in the unconscious that have little points of consciousness of their own. It's as if they have their own motivation at times, and I think that's a really interesting, insightful way to see it. But in any case, it's very much an intuitive process, and when you practice creativity in whatever form you do, you start to listen to these little small voices and these little nudges you get toward, I'm feeling like I should just go play at the piano right now.
Right.
Should I listen to that, or should I just scroll through Instagram and say something stupid on somebody's post? I'm feeling a little nudge to go open my journal. We're not really taught to listen to these, but people who are creative, for various reasons, they have a sensitivity to those little small voices. And so they do listen to those. And I think that's part of the answer.
What do you think passion and obsession, like those two things, and like you're saying, even the little things, it's like we were at the Picasso Museum last year, and him staying up 2 nights in a row and painting 30 paintings in 2 days. He just created $1 billion worth of work in 2 days. But when you look at that, somebody like that, and because there's a lot of people, I feel, especially in today's society, where people are put in little boxes. And so they can't be as creative as they would like to be or feel like they can be. Because of, it's almost bad, and it may be, I don't know, I don't want to judge this, to have this deep passion that you become obsessed over. And because like, well, there's Carl Jung, and he's like, one of your podcasts, you talk about this. He's like, I need to get all the symbols. I need all the alchemical symbols. So my research assistant and then how many thousands of symbols did he find?
Yeah, no, he tried to write a table that was just hundreds of lines long, and one of his colleagues, Marie-Louise von Franz, confirms this, and she was one of the few people who saw it. And he tried to basically catalog every alchemical symbol and term and what its meaning is, but then in the process of him doing that, he started to discover that this alchemist and this alchemist, they define that symbol 2 different ways.
Right.
And so in this table, he tried to catalog it all, and in the end, he didn't give up, but he realized that, okay, there are some symbols that have a universal element to all the alchemists, and then some of them are just defined through their own personal revelation, basically.
But even in that process, just that small, I mean, it wasn't small, it's significant, but I guarantee you he didn't say, I'm going to start this at 9, and then I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take 2 breaks. I'm going to have an hour lunch, and then I'm going to end this at 5.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? This obsession and passion that you see in these creative geniuses, do you think it's vilified, glorified? Like what is your view of that?
I think it's romanticized. It's romanticized in movies, in books, in stories, in narratives. We need those people to exist in society. Those people remind us that there's an inner world that we need to be paying attention to. You look at somebody like Vincent van Gogh, and I didn't know this until I was doing the episodes about him, but he painted 900 paintings in the span of 10 years.
That's crazy.
Before that period of time, he didn't even touch a paintbrush. But there was a point in time where he failed at his job. He worked in an art gallery, and he was a curator for art, and he was supposed to be an art seller. And he failed a couple of these jobs. And then his brother, Theo, who offered support throughout his entire life, said, well, you've always been artistic. You used to draw when we were kids. Why don't you try painting? And then maybe I can help sell your paintings. And for whatever reason, that little nudge in that direction, it opened up this immense doorway that led to 10 years of 900 paintings, like how you were saying. Like, it just became this obsessive pursuit. And if his brother hadn't nudged him, who knows? He, maybe just would have kind of floundered from job to job for the rest of his life, and we wouldn't know who he is. But I think part of it is that maybe we all have these little very rich threads, these veins of gold waiting for us to discover in us. Yes, all it takes is just a little exploration, someone nudging us in a certain direction, or maybe a crisis in life. There were so many people who, from the plague year of COVID, or one or two of those years, they just rethought their entire existence. They quit their job or maybe they were fired, and then they decided to pursue tattooing, and then now they're couldn't be happier. So there's either catalysts that cause us to discover these parts of ourselves, or it takes a little bit of trial and error. We need to kind of get into listening to those parts of ourselves, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's where Jung was so enamored with alchemy. Being able to find, I think one was, he was like, why is this so prevalent in history? Why has it been, and you take a deep dive into the history of alchemy, which is amazing. But whenever you think of alchemy in and of itself, and you've studied it quite a bit, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of it?
Sure. I think it is this thing we're going to come back to about your relationship to matter. And to alchemists, the reason that they're working with matter is because there's a divine spark that's contained in every single element of matter. And through working with it, you first have to purify this substance, or this object if it's working with a plant. And through repeated procedures, you purify that piece of matter, and it starts to become closer to basically unveiling its soul or its divine spark. And then you can work with that. So that goes hand in hand with the three important principles of alchemy, which are represented by the symbols salt, mercury, and sulfur. Mm-hmm. So at the face value, what we hear about alchemy in modern society and movies and such, it's this misguided effort by some medieval people to, just create gold for their own greed. But then you look at something like the three principles of salt, mercury, and sulfur. And when you try to understand what they refer to, you start to see like, oh, this is spiritual work. Because salt is a symbol that refers to the body of a substance, or the physical body of a person. Mercury, even the symbol of Mercury in alchemy, refers to spirit. It's the animating spirit, and it's also the thing that connects the body to sulfur, which represents the soul. So to alchemists, working with any piece of matter, organic or even mineral or metals, they see this trifold nature of matter that they're working with. So it is spiritual work. It is very physical, but those physical things that you're doing cause reactions in you that amount to spiritual work, because you're not only working with the physical substance, which alchemists would argue chemistry and modern science only works with the physical reflection of matter, just the salt. But alchemy tries to address these two other aspects, the spirit and the soul.
Yeah, I love that. And putting this spirituality into your work, like what you're saying now. I mean, this is a very simple principle people can do. I mean, being conscious enough to understand, and that's Carl Jung's whole, being able to understand, who am I? What am I? And understanding that specifically. When you look at when you look at something like that, especially in your personal life, whether it's doing music or whatever, do you take those same elements, like everybody talks about putting soul into music, or from a spiritual aspect, has alchemy changed the way that you produce?
Interesting question. I mean, I would say I haven't been practicing it long enough for it to have that influence. It's certainly changed the way I interact with the world and my relationship again to the world. As far as my creativity is concerned, that has just been kind of chugging along at a steady pace since I was a preteen, and maybe it will influence in time, though, as I do more of the work, because I'm continuing these alchemy courses, and we'll see.
Because I feel like artists have two paths that they can walk down. They can go down this alchemical spiritual path, or whatever you want to call it, where they're looking at themselves being of service to mankind and taking, I believe everybody kind of, whether you want to say it's God, universe, whatever, everybody, there's a reason that we're here for reflections of God. Then we're all unique, snowflakes, you've heard all that before. But I believe that everybody has this creative ability in them. I don't think there's people that are less creative, more creative. I think it's our ability to be able to tap into it. I don't, like some people say, well, I can't do math, or I can't do, but I guarantee you can paint. Everybody can paint,
Sure.
And that's what Rudolf Steiner's thing was, like, everybody can do art, and everybody should do art, and art should be the first thing that you learn in school. Because that is the way that you give. Our creativity is the way that we give our service to mankind. If all of us were more creative, if we had 8 billion people that were operating at max creativity, we would solve most of, the world's problems. So, or you could look at it the other way. Let's take a music. It's like, I need to get on Instagram. I need to get on TikTok. I need to have it go viral. I want to earn millions of dollars. If I just get the next hit, if I just get this, if I can get these beats right, then somebody will listen and pick it up. If I have the right lyrics, we're like, the spiritual alchemical approach is like, I'm working with notes, or I'm working with a keyboard, but there's a spiritual process that goes along with that. And then being able to be conscious enough, whether it's in writing or you doing your podcast or whatever, being able to be conscious enough to allow that salt, mercury, sulfur to infiltrate exactly what you're doing, then how would that change the work? Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Sure. No, totally. I mean, you also touched on something that I was hoping to kind of riff off of for a moment, which was this idea that as a creative, or even as someone who doesn't necessarily think of themselves as a creative, how do you find that purpose in your life? Like, how do you get that secret formula and tap into it and run with it? And it's something that I've only recently started to realize, partially because, honestly, because of the podcast and because of the warm reception that people give back when I create these things. And it's this idea that sometimes in life, you do something, honestly, most of the time, and it feels like you're pushing against the wall. Like, it feels like I want to go be, a comic book illustrator. This is one of my first dreams after I wanted to be a pro wrestler when I was a young kid. And so I want to be a comic book illustrator. I'm going to push into this direction. I'm pushing. And it starts to feel like there's resistance. Like, okay, but I really like this. But there is resistance here. So, okay, I'm going to push in this direction. I'm going to push to be, a classical composer. And then reality has some resistance there. But what you start to notice is occasionally you do something, whether it's a specific kind of art, whether it's specific work, whether it's even just a certain topic in your work that's meaningful to you, but that also reality reacts around you, that people and the mesh of reality starts to pull. It's not pushing anymore, that the brick wall isn't there. It starts to get easy for a second. And if you pay attention to that, you could say that's one of the ways reality is telling you, hey, this is kind of what we need. You know, the mesh of the various points of consciousness around you and these concentric circles that we are, we kind of need this thing you're doing. You happen to like it too. This might be your purpose. And this is the way I've started to view things. When you're doing something and you start to notice reality not only is not creating a barrier, but it's starting to pull a bit. That's a meaningful thing, that things are going to get easier that way, and you should follow that.
I love that. And exactly what you're saying. And because I want to stay here because we have a lot of young people that listen to the show. And obviously, if you're interested in esoteric and spirituality, you know, you're already starting to tap into that creative side of you, because I believe those go hand in hand personally.
Yeah.
It's like, what makes you, I've been moved enough where I've cried over a painting. Now I get it with music.
Totally.
Yeah. It's like, I get it with music, but how can a piece of canvas with some paint on it make you cry? You know what I mean? It's like, how does that even happen? And where is that coming from? You know, and then how did the artist, was he able to do that? And then how can some people go by that same painting and just walk past it real fast? And I'm sitting here trying not to like bawl my eyes out, you know, and then somebody else, I'm walking past the painting and I look and they're crying and I'm like, well, that's ugly, you know, with my limited ego judgment. What do you think, like, because you're talking about bending reality, and I like this, like each person in their creativity, because to me, your creativity is your superpower. You know, I mean, that gives you purpose and meaning in your life. And
right.
Everybody has that. And like you had said, you know, when you're in flow, people call it flow now, or whatever you want to call it. Everybody tries to figure it out scientifically. But like you were saying, the pull is gone, you know, or the push, whatever you were referring to. That it's like, next thing you know, it's 8 hours, and I'm like, oh shit, you know, I did this in 8 hours. But it benefits you too. You know what I mean? Like there's almost like a selfish aspect in the sense of, because it's your life's purpose and your life's work. When you're in that your genius moment, it's benefiting you because you're not tired.
Right.
Sure. You know, you have tons of energy.
Yeah. Like,
what do you view that as, like you're talking about in that push pull, the flow, and bending reality?
I mean, yeah, just to riff off of what you were saying, there are certain things that you can do creatively that feed you just as much as, you know, you put into it. It gives back to you sometimes tenfold. And what that is, I don't know, you know. I personally, I don't question it too much, but I definitely listen to it. Like when, you know, if I'm working on something that's particularly meaningful, whether it's a painting or a piece of music, for me can be very meaningful if I feel like I've achieved something that's actually, that, you know, that in some way I really love. I'll go to bed that night, you know, with a smile on my face. You know, it's just that kind of satisfaction. Right. It feeds you back what you're giving to it. So, and that's obviously a very special place to be. And not everybody feels that they can achieve that. But that's just something, I guess, that comes along with growing with a medium as you spend time with it, I guess. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and for me, you know, just thinking of, you know, I mean, the misrepresentation of alchemy with the gold, you know, like I'm going to create gold. You know, I take that and I use that so much. It's like, okay, I'm in a shitty situation right now. You know, I could be an asshole to this person or whatever it may be, but instead I'm going to allow this situation to turn into gold, you know, for my life. So, you know, and I know we're at the top of the hour, so I want to close, but whenever you're looking at that, MJ, like if you could leave the things that you've learned from Carl Jung, the things that you've learned from alchemy, what like life purposes would you, if you were going to share with someone, these spiritual aspects, what would you leave them with?
Yeah, what would I leave them with? I mean, one of the great lessons from spending time with Jung, reading his works, reading the Red Book, and reflecting on it, is this one of his great quotes that he speaks in the Red Book, which is that the external world and the inner world, there's a relationship there, but that the inner world is just as infinite as the outer one.
Mm-hmm.
And in society, we tend to externalize all our attention for various reasons. One of them being that it wants us, other people and these devices and corporations and politics and news and everything around us wants us to externalize this attention of ours because it can be monetized. We can be convinced to go this way or that way. But inside, there's a lot of stuff in there. And when you look at practices like active imagination, which is one of the core practices of Jungian psychology, you start to realize, like, when you engage those parts of yourself, when you engage a relationship with your unconscious, which you could argue is what art is really about, some really meaningful, substantial things happen that give you value, that give you meaning, that feed you with that energy that we were talking about. And there's some traumas in there too that you got to deal with. Obviously, it's not all fun and games, but in the process of respecting and creating a relationship with your inner world, you really find new value, I think, in life.
I love that. And MJ, if somebody wants to like follow your work, if they want to see all the things, your music, your art, I know you have a shop. What's the best way for them to see what you've created?
Yeah, I mean, the main creative outlet right now is my podcast, Creative Codex, Codex, as you mentioned. And find it on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Otherwise, follow me on Instagram. And my website has some stuff, but usually the stuff it has is related specifically to episodes from the show. So, just head over to Instagram at my name, MJDorian, and I'll be happy to meet you there.
Yeah, I love it. I had to do my trainer made me do a treadmill session for 45 minutes.
Wow.
So I was like, oh, your podcast, because you can get lost in it, especially with the music and everything. So nice. I don't want people to think that you're just talking for an hour long,
Sure.
Like there's an intent. You're doing different voices, you're doing music, your storytelling. I mean, and then the parts that you choose to pick out, is really brilliant. So I encourage people to go to it. I'm a huge fan. And you also have a Patreon, right? Where you have stuff behind a firewall, like the Red Book.
Yeah. That's there's a ongoing project that resulted from me thinking, well, is there a good audiobook about the Red Book where someone reads it and maybe provides some music? And I was very disappointed that there wasn't. But at the same time, I understood it's a very difficult work to try to do justice to. It can get very boring if it's just the voice alone for hours and hours. So I ended up deciding that it might be a cool little exclusive for folks who are really into this topic. So and on my Patreon, every month I read another chapter of the Red Book, and I also add original music to it to very tastefully kind of try to frame some of these things, these topics and visions that Jung is exploring. And then also that's where the Kurt Cobain series is and such, which is full of all kind of copyrighted music that I would otherwise not be able to get away with in the public Spotify and such models.
Yeah, exactly. I understand that completely. Well, MJDorian, this is an absolute privilege. I appreciate you being on the Hard Density Living podcast. This was a great, this is going to help a lot of people, especially in the creative process. And I just appreciate you and your work that you do.
Thank you so much, Jason. I mean, I even love the episode you guys just put out about alchemy. I thought that was very insightful, and I appreciate being on your show and all the things.